Is Nikki Haley an alternative or an annoyance, an insurance policy or a vanity project? Haley says she's the winner Republicans are looking for in 2024, but winners, well, they need to win. Haley will not do that in Saturday's South Carolina Republican primary. That's not our prediction. We don't do such things. That's Haley. She's not predicting victory, only that she will be competitive. South Carolina will reward 50 delegates, 29 to the statewide winner, which very much looks like it will be former President Trump. It will also award 3 delegates in each congressional district. But you must win the district to claim those 3 delegates. There is a very real chance Haley won't win a single district, shut out in her own home state. Not just a loss, but a mathematically brutal one. Currently, Trump leads Haley 63-17 in delegates. After South Carolina, that total could be as high as 113-17. Haley says she's not going anywhere and, for the moment, has the money to back up that long-shot promise. For Trump and Republicans, that means there's no alternative. Or is there? Here in Washington, Trump already looms over elected Republicans seen on President's Day when House Speaker Mike Johnson chose to spend the long weekend at Mar-a-Lago. Johnson leads the disorganized and very slim House Republican majority with pressure on him to avoid a government shutdown and pass aid to Israel and Ukraine. And that is where we begin. Margaret Brennan and Scott MacFarlane join us now. Margaret, of course, is CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and the moderator of Face the Nation. Scott is CBS News congressional correspondent. Scott and Margaret, I want to play for you something that Patrick McHenry, chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, very experienced vote counter, close to the House Republican leadership, told me about the pending Senate bill with aid to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and other matters. Let's play that.
What is axiomatic about the House is that any speaker can stand in the way of a majority will on the House floor for a period of time, but not permanently. And here we have a substantial majority in the House of Representatives that is for the defense supplemental that the Senate passed. They support 80 to 90% of what's in the bill, and about 2/3 of the House is of that opinion. It will get done.
Scott MacFarlane, when you hear Patrick McHenry say we'll get done and a speaker can stand in the way of the will of the House, but not permanently, what does that tell you?
There's such little time, and what Patrick McHenry, I think, is arguing unambiguously is that they're going to find a way to do this with both parties again. Just like they did in September, just like they did in November, they're going to hit a snooze button to temporarily extend spending into 2024 with that same bipartisan coalition that has kept the lights on and the doors open in the federal government. Potentially, the same coalition we saw avert a debt ceiling crisis, and potentially, Major, the same coalition that will be needed to get Ukraine funding and Israel funding. Some of this is going around the Speaker of the House, even though the Speaker of the House is kind of opening the door to let folks in. I was struck in particular late today by the statement from the House Freedom Caucus, the more conservative members of the Republican conference, blasting leadership for not giving enough information on how they're going to keep the government open. What's the spending deal that's going to be passed before March 1st? If they don't know, if they haven't been informed, they're not going to like the outcome. And it seems quite clear the only outcome involves one of two things: a shutdown on this third attempt, or that same bipartisan coalition keeping the doors open.
Margaret, from your perspective, talking to those in the top echelons of the Biden White House and diplomats from across Europe, what is their sense of the next couple, 3 weeks here in Washington? Because a lot of things are really hanging in the balance, not only in international policy, but domestically as well.
We're on a knife's edge, and particularly coming off of the weekend and the gathering in Munich of all of these world leaders, there's this sense of how are they not getting how essential this is, and also once again underscoring the critical role the United States plays, not just in funding and leading, but in actually manufacturing weapons. There's a huge bottleneck. You know, Europe, as the EU, just pledged $50 billion, but they can't manufacture quickly enough or efficiently enough to be able to make a difference in the near term the way the United States of America could if they turned on the financial resources that Congress holds the purse strings to here. And that is the problem. So Congress being on vacation, essentially, in the House until March is a very real issue. And the White House National Security Advisor came out yesterday and drew it in stark terms, saying that the loss of this town in eastern Ukraine that Ukrainian forces had to pull out of, giving Vladimir Putin his first significant battlefield victory in some time, is directly related to Speaker Johnson not putting this bill on the floor. Now, he's making his own political prosecution point. Some Democrats quietly say, we wish we got more air cover from the White House on this. Why aren't they coming out and saying, hey, Mr. Republican lawmaker, in your district, they would make this many bullets, and therefore this funding would help? And why not prosecute that case a little harder to make it more uncomfortable for some of these lawmakers to force the speaker? But that's where we are in these complicated politics. And there's a very real world impact for the people of Ukraine.
Reaching back to a phrase from a different era, arsenal of democracy. Patrick McHenry also told me when I asked him, I said, should the death of Alexei Navalny encourage or expedite or create greater political momentum behind aid for Ukraine? He said it should. It definitely should. It should send a signal to the holdouts in the House Republican Conference that the United States, the West, is up against something that is much darker than you are currently assuming. Do you have any sense that this tragic event that has sort of galvanized world attention on Putin again in a very negative way could have a larger political impact? I
think it makes it more uncomfortable, certainly for some of the Republican senators and some congressmen who had created problems in the passage of that $95 billion supplemental that went through the Senate and is stuck in Congress right now. But what you heard, and McHenry, you could tell how annoyed he was in that conversation with you. He knows that and would argue the votes are there. The majority of Republicans are there. It's stuck at the top. It's stuck at the Speaker's office and not putting this forward. You can go through those obscure methods and discharge petitions and the like to try to bypass the Speaker. But ultimately, the death of Alexei Navalny just underscores how emboldened Vladimir Putin apparently feels in this moment in time to be able to, as the U.S. would suggest, take out one of his biggest political threats, who was in a penal colony and not exactly about to rise to office, but still a threat in undermining his legitimacy. Another point coming out of that Munich Security Conference is this quote these European leaders are pointing back to, saying this feels like a 1930s moment of an emboldened Vladimir Putin, the United States going back to isolationism, not necessarily being fully on board with providing the financial wherewithal to turn the tide here. And at this moment in time where it feels very uncomfortable. And that interview with Tucker Carlson that Vladimir Putin did recently, he mentioned Poland 30 times. He pointed again and again and again back at NATO. So this idea that somehow... Echoes of World War II, for sure. Exactly. And it's causing those in the national security space to be very concerned. And for those pundits who want to say that foreign policy doesn't matter to U.S. elections, someone hasn't told Donald Trump that. Because in virtually every Trump speech these days, he's talking a lot about NATO, isn't he? He certainly is. Certainly thinks people care. Scott, I want to ask you about other developments that might be in front of the House Republicans in the not-too-distant future. Continued testimony gathered about an inquiry into a possible impeachment of the president and a confidential witness, all of that. Can you wrap some of that up? And I know you had a conversation with a Democratic member of the House who has very strong opinions about what's happening.
Oh, the twists and turns of Alexander Smirnov, Major. He was to be a backbone of this Republican effort to have an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. He had told the FBI there was some scheme between the president, his son Hunter, and Ukraine to enact bribes or pocket bribe money. He's no longer the backbone of this impeachment inquiry. He could be the undoing of it. He's not only charged with making false statements by the feds about President Biden and his son, he's now raising questions about whether he's connected to Russian intelligence and whether this is a misinformation campaign by Russian intelligence agents to mess with the 2024 election. We spoke with Republicans today who say they will proceed ahead, that their whole impeachment inquiry is not based on Alexander Smirnov. Democrats say this thing's got to end, that this should be a death knell to any inquiry. Here's Dan Goldman from New York.
The time for asking inquisitive questions was finished about a year ago. And now the Republicans are using an official committee of the Congress, in fact, several official committees, to simply do partisan bidding for Donald Trump that is being pushed and supported by Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Major, this was to be a landmark day in the probe. They brought the president's brother James here to Capitol Hill for questioning behind closed doors. Instead of talking about that, they're answering questions about Alexander Smirnov. And I'll tell you this, from being outside that room all day, Jim Jordan, top Republican on the House Judiciary Committee, left hours early, didn't even stay for the end of James Biden's interview.
Scott MacFarlane on Capitol Hill, Margaret Brennan here at the desk with me. Thank you both so very much.